the ways in which scholarship is distributed is often restricted and confined by economic and legal realities that make it difficult for people to access information. It is estimated that scholarly publishing is a $25 billion a year industry where copyright is held for much of the content is licensed by a handful of publishers. We in the library here at Northwestern try to do everything that we can within our power to provide you with seamless access to information for your research and teaching purposes. But the privileges that we have at Northwestern are not necessarily shared and common among our peers around the world, not even among our peers in the Chicagoland area. So about 15 years ago, this problem of information access motivated scholars to define a model for sharing information called open access. And that model is based in the principles of keeping copyright retained by the author and to use the internet to make information freely distributed on the internet for free. So scholars typically make research materials open access through two ways. One is they publish in open access journals and books, and the other way is to use open access repositories to archive versions of their work in order to provide free of charge access to that content. We in the library created Arch, which is an open access repository, and I have handouts for those that I'll be distributing later on. We created this repository to give scholars at Northwestern one method of making their research and opening it up to people of the world. So people, anyone at Northwestern can log in with a net ID and deposit any of their unpublished materials, anything they hold a copyright to. This could be presentations, lectures, data sets, all sorts of scholarly information that might not otherwise be available out there in order to share knowledge with the world. So around the time that I and my colleagues in digital scholarship got Arch up and running, I was introduced to our speaker, Professor Richard Joseph. He's a faculty member in the Departments of Political Science and African Studies and has devoted his scholarly career to the study of African politics. So over the course of getting to know Professor Joseph, we worked to collect many of his writings and many of his other scholarly works to clear the permissions, make sure that there are no copyright liabilities, and to archive them into Arch and in order to provide the people of Africa access to his work, which is all about African politics and democracy and governance, which he'll be talking about in greater detail. So one thing that we worked on is collecting a volume called The Nigerian Crucible, and working with him and his research team has been one of the most exciting things about thing that I've worked on in my professional career, because providing access to scholarly information to people in other parts of the world is exactly what we hope to do by creating Arch and what we hope to do in working with other faculty members around campus and students too. So that's sort of the basis and the sort of the framing of why we asked Professor Joseph to come and give a talk today. And so without further ado, please welcome me in joining Professor Richard Joseph.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. You know, this time of day and the middle of the quarter, you know, I didn't know, you know, how many people I'll be looking out to. So this is a very warming sight on a day where we need some warmth in addition to the coffee. All right. So anyway, just absolutely delighted. So many wonderful, familiar faces here in the room. Oh, I even see some of my colleagues from some of my circle. Way to go, Guy. And I want to, you know, welcome Professor Zachariah to campus. We've been waiting for him a very, very, very long time. But he will have opportunities to do that in future. Chris Diaz, what an amazing guy. There's amazing people at Northwestern. I was so glad when we met him. And the way in which he and a research assistant of mine, who's now out in the real world, worked together to get this started was really something to see. So we have really set up incredible collaboration, and we'll talk about it, as we go forward. So my thanks to Chris Diaz, my thanks to his colleagues, and it's so good to see the Dean. Thank you, Dean. You don't have to read about what I'm doing in memos and so on. He actually comes to events. And so as my students hear from me over and over again, presence, being present, and use the Dean as a model of being present. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much, Esmeralda Kale and your colleagues. And she's a curator of the Herzkovitz Library. And, Esmeralda is responsible for so much that's already happened and so much that we have ahead. Thanks to Alexander Smith. He can't be here. He's the research assistant who is working with me at present. And he's the one who put together this PowerPoint. Mary Finn, I don't know if Mary is here. But Mary and Bill Harlow, thank you all very much. Amazing boost that we were given with the support for the students. And we have, I think, I saw one of the students present. It's very good that this is being videotaped so it could be shared beyond that. Somebody who is not present because she's up in Canada for the 103rd birthday of her mother is my wife, Jennifer. And Jennifer has done an extraordinary amount of work, on these archives and so on. All right. So when the opportunity came up, and it didn't take me very long. I mean, Chris Diaz says, there's this opportunity, we'd like you to give a talk. Could you, take a few days, send me a topic? Well, it took me like about 2 minutes, I think, maybe 3. But, and the topic was, building peace and democracy, why open access is so vital. As I've been working on it, in fact, the one question has become 3. It's why open access is vital. That's a formal talk. But then the question came up, how has it been vital to me? And then the third question was, why me? And so the way in which I get to the last 2 questions, you'll see, is going to be with a gallery of photos I've put together at the end. So if you're thinking of ducking out, you're going to be missing something very exciting. I didn't do an exhaustive search for photographs, but most of them have never been seen, as is the case, of course, with most of the papers here that the students have been looking at. So what I have in mind, is that this work would become a multimedia project on archives, both archives in the sense that put away and people go and study, but archives that are much more sort of living archives made actively available. And it also is going to include, one of my research assistants gave me the term, this is immersive learning, and I'm just so conscious of it. Okay, as I've proceeded with this work, past and present, instead of being linear, became more and more circular. And in fact, I found myself digging up. Many of you will be familiar with William Faulkner in Requiem for a Nun. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. And then also, I know many of you, at least the American present, would have read The Great Gatsby and the closing line of The Great Gatsby, and when he talks about our boats, beating our boats, and moving against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And so the more I got involved in that process was the more I had this experience. And in fact, I am going to read in a little while the last paragraph from this book of mine, which, and let me just say a word about it. It's Democracy and Prebendal Politics in Nigeria, published by Cambridge University Press in 1987, a Nigerian edition in 1991. There was a conference in Lagos, just devoted to this book in 2011, and there'll be one of the slide photos there for it. Which prodded Cambridge University Press to reissue it. And in fact, when on my last trip to Nigeria, one of my close colleagues there was being discussed so much, he said to me, he sent me an email, he said, would you be willing to have us prepare a condensed version so we could just make this available for like mass distribution in Nigeria? I told him I'll think about it. But anyway, just to let you know that the issues, the Nigerian crucible, that they not only work that was done in the past, they're very much part of the present. All right, I start off with two quotes here, and these are two students. And by the way, students are just part of my life. So I have some students here, some in my current courses, and and this is what I do. I work with students. I work with other people, but especially with students. And anyway, these are two of my former students, now established. Amy Petit. And Amy Petit was an undergraduate at Emory. I was working at Emory and the Carter Center. And Amy was part of a team. We're going to put up Africa Demos, a bulletin we produced. And she's now at Concordia and one of the leading experts on Botswana. So anyway, she sent me a message, and her visit happened to coincide with the funeral for former President Masire. And she sent me this quote that it seems like the end of an era, and it really captures, I think, our feeling that we are at the end of an era. Scott Taylor, another student, but Scott went even further back than Emory. He was a student of mine, undergraduate at Dartmouth. And of course, we have the dean who was formerly at Dartmouth. And Scott joined me. He came to Emory and also was a graduate student there on the team. And he's, again, an established scholar, especially on Southern Africa. And he sent me this statement, because we were talking about the situation in Kenya, the situation in Zambia, and he came up with this phrase. I came across just a little note from a Nigerian professor called Ikena Onyido, who is in chemistry. He and his family arrived in Nigeria at the University of Ibadan. And by the way, we have Professor Lori Denza here, who spent many years also at the University of Ibadan. But anyway, and so we were there for a few months trying to get our apartments and all the rest. But he sent me this message after he had gone on and was the vice chancellor of a university in eastern Nigeria. And he was talking about the conditions that he had to deal with. And he had this phrase that is so pitiable. Now, for anybody who have been involved in a lot of these university education and so on, during a lot of those periods, I'm afraid this captures a lot of the situation. And I can't go any further, but we even have African scholars here who could themselves speak to it. The other quotes are very pretty obvious. I don't have to read them. You all would see them for yourself and see their pertinence. This is now up on Arch Library. We just, overnight, the second volume went up of the Nigerian Crucible. Now, not only the difficulty of having access to published works, but the fact is that most of what I have written on Nigeria is not available to most Nigerians because they're in international publications and so on. And anyway, so I've been working on this for some time, and it really came just ideally, all right, that Arch came on board and we're able to start now doing this process. It's a very detailed, intensive process because I reread everything, annotate them, they're footnoted, and all of the rest, new introductions and so on to it. But it means now that, and we've just finished, and you see the period there, right up until 1999. And before I move on, I just want to read to you all the closing pages. They want to achieve the notoriety of Faulkner on Fitzgerald, but at least in my world, they are pretty notorious. Anyway, the last paragraph when I published this book, and this book was about the Nigerian transition to civilian rule after a period of military rule and the civil war. And I was in Nigeria at that time and was able to study it, right? And then I left Nigeria and wrote up this book. And it was clear to me while I was writing this book that this republic, this second republic in Nigeria, was really going to be endangered by a lot of the practices I was studying. But anyway, I wrote, The major political challenge which confronts Africa in the next quarter century of independent rule, now we're beyond that quarter century now, we're 3 decades beyond that, is to evolve forms of political order in which history is made relevant to the present in a positive way. And then the last lines are, such a process requires of political actors and commentators a long view of the contemporary historical period. There are no quick fixes for Africa's post-colonial predicament in all its ramifications. This study of the political travails and temporary triumphs of Africa's most populous nation ends, therefore, on a note of moderate optimism. After the completion of the current cycle of political rule by military officers, perhaps some author will have good reason to write of the political triumphs and temporary travails of the Third Republic. All right, what we've just posted on is that abortive Third Republic, and I was writing at the time, all right? And I must tell you, just going through my published articles, op-ed articles, speeches in Nigeria, testimony before Congress, dealing with what was happening in Nigeria, even for myself, was really quite an experience. Africa Demos, as I mentioned, was published the first issue was published in 1990. And at the Carter Center, and again, working with my students, researchers, you had all these changes in Africa. And the question was, how could we capture, monitor these, and make the information available in a way that would help people understand what was going on, right? Thanks to the Hertzkovitz Library and Esmeralda's predecessor, we were able to scan, upload, make it available on the library, the whole issue now that people can read, and it has now been carried over to Arch Library. The same thing for Africa Plus. This is a blog that I started in 2012, and it's not, I would say maybe about a third of the posts include other colleagues during that period, and once again, that is also up on Arch and available. All right. Eric Williams. How many people here have heard about Eric Williams? Okay. All right. Well, if you ask me, well, is there anybody who would like to think of yourself in terms of my intellectual political lineage? It will be Dr. Eric Williams. Eric Williams was the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. I was born in Trinidad. Eric Williams went to Oxford. He did his DPhil. He had his doctoral thesis published by Oxford University Press. I've been tracking Eric Williams in quite a ways. But one of the reasons why, even when I was thinking of open access and I thought of Eric Williams, was, and I will show you a photograph. You'll get to see me, as a boy, and see a photograph. I left Trinidad just around my 13th birthday, and so in the 3 years or so before leaving Trinidad, I was able to experience the whole anti-colonial movement. But Eric Williams and people who study this period would have heard of something called the University of Woodford Square. And the University of Woodford Square was just a regular square, all right, in downtown Port of Spain. But Eric Williams, in his rallies there, and I remember as a boy being taken to stand out there, and he converted those political rallies during that movement into instructing. Here was somebody had published this pioneering book on capitalism and slavery. And if you could imagine that same person talking to his people and taking them through in that way. So for me, literally my coming to being aware of the political process was also connected to this incredible experience of what Eric Williams represented. Okay, let me, I'm not quite sure what is the next slide, but let me go into my text because I don't want to jump ahead with some of the photographs that I'm urging you to stay for. All right. I first learned of digital scholarship as a member of the board of the American Council of Learned Societies, ACLS, from 1991 to 1997. In fact, I have to send a message to Stanley Katz, letting him know that after all these years, I am myself connecting with what he was so fervent about. So 2 decades later, I am aware of my own involvement in digital scholarship and of its importance in research, teaching, and policy analysis. Digital learning complements and extends conventional modes of scholarly communication. The topics to which I have devoted the greatest attention, state systems, democracy, security, governance, and development, are more complicated than ever. My close colleague, Stanford professor Larry Diamond, about whom my students get to hear a fair amount, wrote in 2014, and I quote, "A zone of democracy is also a zone of peace and security." Now, I would add today that such zones are retreating further from us. Broader participation in the construction of knowledge, its recuperation and dissemination, are essential to overcoming the widening social and political chasms in America and the world. Access to knowledge in Africa is often narrow, despite the internet and the creation of hundreds of colleges and universities. Instruction is usually of poor quality, mediocre quality. Unsatisfactory conditions often oblige the best scholars to migrate abroad, while libraries are usually deficient. Most academic books, even by African scholars, have small print runs and are often unaffordable locally. The great majority of international journals are not accessible. The construction of knowledge about Africa should fully engage and be accessible to Africans along with everyone else. Knowledge of what has actually occurred in the pursuit of peace and democracy is vital, and even more so today. Here is a useful definition of vital taken from the web. Quote, "Necessary to the existence, continuous, or well-being of something, indispensable, essential, vital for a healthy society." Open access to knowledge is rendered more vital as, quote, "truth has been relativized and even denied." Our societies are rendered unhealthy by the deliberate perversion of knowledge and dismissal of facts. How important then to provide access to undeniably factual documents composed and shared as major peace and democracy exercises in Africa were underway. I was told about Arch Library this spring following a meeting convened by Esmeralda Cali. A subsequent meeting with Chris Diaz showed how this entity could facilitate the active sharing of information and analyses with scholars, students, and the general public. As the director of the African Governance Program of the Carter Center, I'm referring to myself, 1988 to 1994, I saw the need to make information and analyses of peace and democratic processes more widely available. A small group of students, as I mentioned, produced Africa Demos. And I mentioned already, and together with Africa Plus, that was produced here at Northwestern. In 2017, this work underwent a quantum leap, thanks to support from Northwestern's office, the Weinberg College Office of Undergraduate Research, the Farrell Fellowship Program of Northwestern, the Northwestern Office of Undergraduate Research, the Farrell Fellowship Program, and the Undergraduate Research Program of Weinberg College, which provided a fund for the support of students. Also, funds from the MacArthur Foundation, Institute of International Education, and superb facilities by the Transportation Center made this work possible. A forum series on democracy and insecurity in Africa in Evanston and Chicago in the spring was followed by a pilot project based on my extensive archives on Carter Center initiatives. Now, I was involved, along with other Carter Center officials, in several of these initiatives. For a quarter century, I have preserved thousands of internal documents along with published materials. And I will point out here that the Carter Center, like all the presidential libraries and so on, they have their very important library and archives, and those are federally supported. Now, although the Carter Center has been as active as it's been over 3 decades, there has been no system, right, for deliberately archiving a lot of the materials that took place. Now, when I left the Carter Center, I gathered up those documents right? And if I didn't, they would be lost because there was no provision. And unfortunately, as I say, from my recent visit to the Carter Center, there's still no provision for it. So the value of that work, and in fact, the work I intend to be doing together with others who've been involved as myself at the Carter Center. So together with the incredible holdings that we have at the Hertzkovitz Library, there are just tremendous opportunities that we have for immersive learning. All right, let me say a word about immersive learning. Well, I didn't mean to keep Eric up for so long. All right, how's that? As I mentioned, the term immersive learning was mentioned by one of the students in our project this summer, Michael Ritzoff. Another, Alexander Smith, and he can't be here today as I mentioned, referred to the archives as, quote, windows to the past. Alex highlighted the opportunity they provided to experience, and I quote him again, he's great with language, the complex tapestry of these transitional moments. Now, my wife and I recently visited an exhibit at the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago, and I, recommend, of course, we have great exhibits here at the Block Museum, but I also recommend the one, it's called Revolution Every Day at the Smart Museum, and it's on post-revolutionary graphic art and videos in the Soviet Union. But the program notes really caught my attention. It said, it immerses visitors in the distinct textures and speeds of everyday life. And you really felt that, being in that situation and seeing the videos and seeing the posters, really bringing back to you those moments within the Soviet Union, which, in the midst of time have sort of disappeared. Now, the opportunity to undertake such projects for peace and democracy initiatives in Africa, drawing on multimedia materials, was something that I have become personally very excited about. Now, I have a reference here to an ongoing exhibit that I was reading about in Santiago, Chile, having to do with the United States, Nixon and Kissinger, and the overthrow of Allende and the arrival of Pinochet and so on. And I'm just reading it again. And here again, I hear the words of that museum director. This exhibit is a victory in the fight against negationism, the efforts to deny and relativize what happened during our dictatorship. So, the opportunity for immersive learning experiences that can be created regarding peace, democracy, and autocracy in Africa. Some of my good colleagues here, the Sullivans, work on the Congo, and many of you work on, we have a Sally Nur in Eritrea. Many people here in the room would understand, what I'm referring to. But how, you can not only study these, sometimes from a distance, but being immersed so you could really understand what they were about. My personal archives, and they are extensive. In addition to what the students have seen in that room, I have a lot of materials. I hold on to most things after my early days. So they extend over the half-century of my involvement in African studies, and that half-century will be registered in January of this year. And again, Laurie and I, we share something very special, having worked with this great man. I'll put his photograph up there. His name is Thomas Hodgkin, in 1968. But they go back even further, and to the American Civil Rights Movement. And many people don't know this about me. Most people would know me in terms of my Africa work. Most people don't know me in terms of my work in the United States, starting from my years at Dartmouth. And by the way, talking about open access, the two first projects I started at Dartmouth, starting in my sophomore year, was one entitled Negro Applications Encouragement Program. And this was to get the students involved with actually going out and recruiting black students. And the other one was called the Valley Tutorial Program, getting students involved in the neighboring communities, in the high schools and other schools and so on. But anyway, But especially the summer of 1967, which I spent in Sunflower County, Mississippi, working with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I will put her photograph up there. She just turned 100 years. And I also worked with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. In fact, right after I graduated, when I left Dartmouth, I was working in Washington, D.C. for the MFDP. I do have some letters and so on, and I have boxes I haven't opened up, and I'm sure there are going to be some very interesting materials to find here. All right. A few highlights, and I'm keeping my eye here because I really want to, give you all an opportunity to, to have some questions. We have already talked about the Nigerian crucible, so I'm not going to say anything more about that. The first entry in the Nigerian crucible, part 1, I was only 1 year in Nigeria, and I was invited to take part in a meeting on the Nigerian draft constitution. Now, every time I look at that volume, I'm amazed by it because the participants were all such leading figures in Nigeria, including people who went on to be, a president of the country like Shagari and others. And I was the only non-Nigerian in the room, and it turned out that I was the first person called upon to present, and I was speaking on the draft constitution and a particular, chapter of it. I won't go into the details, but that is all in there. And the last entry that we have in the Nigerian crucible is a lecture that I delivered in Lagos in June 1999, and that was delivered after 15 years of successive military government, and when Nigeria was now once again returning back to civilian rule. Right, and so that period is captured in these documents. And I've already mentioned about the work of the research assistants this summer. I have here, it might not be possible, by the way, this talk, and there are lots of footnotes to it, and once it's ready, it's going to be made available. I will work with Chris, and hopefully we'll get it up on Arch, and so it would be available to you. Oh, by the way, this was the at the conference to launch not to launch, but to celebrate the 25th anniversary of democracy and prebendal politics. The person that time, I didn't have all my hair this hair on now. That was my shaved hair period, but I assure you that's me. In fact, a funny thing is, I remember one time I was in Nigeria, giving a talk, and I was sitting there, up at the podium and everything, ready to get started. And people were coming in, and they kept looking at the photograph and looking up at the guy up there, and it didn't look the same. All right, but anyway. But the person next to me, his name is Dr. Kayode Fayemi. Dr. Kayode Fayemi spent a year with us here at Northwestern as a visiting scholar, Program of African Studies. He wrote his book, Out of the Shadows, on the period of his involvement in the struggle during the Abacha dictatorship. Just about a week or so after this event, which he helped, organize the funds for, as an international conference, the Nigerian, the court ruled, the federal appeal court ruled in his favor. All right, just happened in Kenya, throughout the election for governor, and installed him. So he served as governor of Ekiti State. He's now a minister of solid materials and petroleum. And then standing next to him is somebody representing the governor of Lagos State. Now, my Elsmerada Kale, she and I share something, namely Cameroon, which was something of my early work. And I remember, and I think I probably said it at that conference. My first book, my doctoral study, was on Cameroon, and we can have a photograph up there. And I said at the time, you could not imagine a conference like this taking place in Yaoundé, Cameroon, on my book on Cameroon. It was just inconceivable. And that would be my first book. And it certainly wouldn't be one of my second book, which was banned by the government of Cameroon, and put somebody up there who was involved in it. But anyway, so talking about access to knowledge. All right, anyway, that is Jennifer there. Jennifer was not pleased when she saw her name, and she had to go up and sit up there. But anyway, that's her. And that's, All right, this was a recent event. We, some of the students who were with me, we had to brave the storm with Irma, but we did have a meeting. We had this incredible meeting with President Carter. But let me get to, oh yes. And so I've mentioned Thomas Hodgkin. There he is, the great man, and you all would know the name Hodgkin, and that would immediately tell you what, his pedigree. And this is David Goldie. David Goldie was my supervisor in Oxford, and somebody, again, and his wife, extremely dear to me. Unfortunately, they're both deceased. All right, so I'm just going to put up, from the reports of the students who worked this summer, I've just summarized some of what they said. So if you could just quickly skim it, I won't read it. So it's important to see what the reactions of the students themselves were to this experience. By the way, and while I'm going through it, I was thinking, because the students, I gave them the frame, it was put together very quickly. I said, are you all going to have access to those archives? Allison was working, culling it, and I had to see those materials. I had to see what sensitive documents might be in there and so on. So we were really working in that kind of a way. But they had to pretty much work it out themselves. You were having access to this. And it was something to see them actually doing that. And for me, this is also very important. I believe very strongly in not telling students, everything to do, but, giving them the opportunities to figure it out. And they certainly did. And so I'll just leave, these up for, just a few moments. We're going to have a longer version of it, available to you so you can hear what the students are saying. This was a pilot project, but I think we've laid the basis, some very important work going forward. Here's Michael's. He worked on Ghana, and he was also in that photograph with President Carter. And this is Andy. He's sitting here. He worked on Zambia, and Zambia was a really sad case. Ghana was they were both successful elections, but the consequences were not the same. All right, we'll get back to him in a second. All right. As the quote from Larry Diamond earlier reflects, peace building and democracy promotion were once viewed as twin processes, especially as the Cold War drew to a close. That nexus, however, has been strained as national security concerns and the global and autocracy has resurged globally. Liberal democracy was long linked to the capacity to hold governments accountable. And then I go on to talk, and this is a lot in my work, what is happening to elections, what is happening to democratic my class is currently studying liberalism and the retreat of democracy, and also the upsurge in violence and in political repression. We've seen what has happened with the quote-unquote Arab Spring, Egypt and Turkey. The reversals of peace and democracy in increasing number of countries, Thailand, Myanmar, Burundi, Congo, Venezuela, to name a few. This is a time of deeper reflection and wider consultation as peaceful paths to democracy and democratic paths to peace are becoming obscured. As you all are well aware, not only the difficulty of conducting elections, having honest, fair elections, having a level playing field, but now we have the insurgence of cyber techniques. I listened to a presentation at Stanford in January, and it was actually chilling because African regimes now, in addition to all of the things we're used to them doing, are now themselves accessing those technologies. It's not only that you have a foreign power that is trying to intervene, but that you have those regimes actually intervening themselves and going forward. All right. I'll conclude because I do want to just run through some photographs here since I promised you all that. I do have in mind two projects that would emerge out of this work that we've been doing. The first one I'm calling Freedom Gates. In fact, that was a title I had for a book I was planned to do on President Carter and his involvement. And it's now become a broader concept dealing with peace and democracy. And also a governance and development learning network. When I gave my inaugural address here at Northwestern, the title was Misgovernance and the African Predicament. Can the Code Be Broken? Now, if you were to read the article on South Africa in the New York Times today, I mean, you could just change some names and so on. You could be talking about Nigeria. I mean, those processes are these processes of misgovernance that we now have in so many parts of the country. So the question is, can the code be broken? Whatever is the code that brings this about. But also, can good governance be taught? Can it be learned? I have been invited, like I said, to give this talk in Addis Ababa. It's a major meeting. It's the annual conference of the Economic Commission for Africa and the African Development Bank. And the topic is governance for structural transformation. I've been asked to give the plenary address. It will follow the address by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and that will be interesting in itself. I say no more. All right, I'm going to run through some photographs here of people. Malcolm X is, as a senior at Dartmouth, I invited Malcolm X to speak, and the experience, and unfortunately, less than 5 weeks later, he was killed, and it was a really sad experience. Unfortunately, we don't have, and a lot of these early things, when I go back to it, there were no photographs. There's no recording of his speech. But I do have a letter from Malcolm, and that someday it will go to the rightful place. Fannie Lou Hamer, this is somebody very, very dear to me. I met her first at Dartmouth. I went and worked, for the MFDP in Washington, D.C. And then my second year after graduation, I was in France on a Fulbright, then I was at Oxford. And the first year after that, I went straight from Oxford. I stopped a little bit to see friends in Massachusetts, and straight to Mississippi. And as far as I was concerned, I was finished with higher education. Mrs. Hamer learned from a good friend of mine that I was a Rhodes Scholar. He explained to her what a Rhodes Scholar was, and Mrs. Hamer said there was no way she was going to allow me to pass up my work. But anyway, a really dear woman, unfortunately, and I do have a letter from Mrs. Hamer after I left. There might be more in I just learned from my younger sister, that in fact the communication took place between Mrs. Hamer and my mother when I was in Mississippi. I wasn't even aware of it. I guess my mother wanted to know where the Dickens is my son, and Mrs. Hamer and she communicated. But anyway, an amazing woman. Reuben Umniobe, he's unfortunately somebody who is, would not be known to many of you. Reuben Umniobe was the leader of the nationalist movement in Cameroon. Had Umniobe been the leader of a movement, anti-colonial movement, in a former British colony, there's a very good chance that, like Nkrumah and Kenyatta and the others, he would have been arrested. And then with the upsurge in the fervor, he would have been released. He would have run for election, and he would have been the first prime minister of Cameroon, and he'd be well known to all of you. The French did not function in that way, and unfortunately, he died after the Cameroonians undertook an armed struggle. And my initial research was where I was able to discover how this came about, because I was able to have access to a lot of the French documents, to interview a lot of former colonial officials, and anyway, Reuben Umniobe, but they're talking about open access and even the access to the history of these countries. John Fruendi, and Esmeralda would know him. I didn't have the time to go find, this came off the web. He is a leader of the Social Democratic Party in Cameroon. But I'll tell you a very interesting moment. John Friendly visited the Carter Center when I was there, and he was speaking. And I raised my hand, and then I said to him that, well, it's good. And then I said, well, I've done some work in Cameroon. He said, really? He said, what have you done? I said, well, I've done some writing on Cameroon. So then he pushed me a little bit more, and then he said, and what's your name? And I said, my name is Richard Joseph. I mean, he literally blanched. I mean, and the reason why he blanched, Fruindi was a bookseller, and he said, I used to sell your book. I used to keep it under, I could, and the book was published in Enugu, Nigeria, and used to be smuggled across the border. The title was Gaullist Africa, Cameroon under Amadou Ahidjo. So that was a moment of him, I have been selling this guy's book basically as contraband, and here he is at the Carter Center, the Fellow for African Governance. But anyway, we'll dig up that photograph of him. I'll go through very quickly. These are some of my students at the University of Ibadan. This is Chief Obafemi Awolowo, who should have been another man who should have been president of Nigeria. Nigeria would be a lot better off if he had been, but the leader of Southwest Yoruba, Nigeria and the Yoruba people for a long time. Kenneth Kaunda, this was my first meeting with him. I had a lot to do with Kaunda during the elections transitions in Zambia, but this was our first meeting in his library. The dear Betty Shabazz, and we were able to sit there and really reminisce and talk about it. First time I'd seen him, unfortunately, Betty died very tragically through, her own grandson. But Oliver Tambo, I have to mention to many people that I traveled to South Africa several times in the early 1990s because we were preparing at the Carter Center for a possible mission in South Africa. Things have turned out well, but at that time it wasn't known. And so I was able to meet. And here I met Oliver Tambo, the president of the ANC, but this meeting took place in Lusaka. Andrew Young, got to know Andrew Young very well in Atlanta, in a lot of contexts, but when I get a time, I'll talk to you about Andrew Young and what we were trying to do with regard to Nigeria under the military dictatorship, and what we were trying to mobilize, and the lack of success we were having with Washington. In fact, in the work we were doing this summer with the students, I was able to come across a lot of communications I didn't even realize, that President Carter was involved in. This is the Zambian elections. This was a great moment in Africa. This is the first time we had a major figure like Kenneth Kaunda and his party being defeated in elections. And this was when we were standing overseeing the counting of the votes. Well, a moment that many of us will forever treasure. My meeting with Nelson Mandela, it took a while to get this done, but it was all part of these conversations that were taking place at the time. I have many photographs like this. Many people here would not know, but the guy over in the left, to your left, the extreme left, his name is Meles Zenawi. Meles Zenawi, he died a few years ago. This was during the struggle against Mengistu, and he was the leader of the TPLF and went on to be the leader of it. But this was just one of many meetings taking place in, most likely the home of the ambassador in Khartoum. This is Sadiq Al-Mahdi and this was a mission that we're involved in with Sudan. The war was going on then with the South. And this was prior to the overthrow of Al-Mahdi government. And of course, al-Bashir is still there, but a lot of work. And by the way, all the things I'm showing you here, there's nothing written up about them because most people would know President Carter did this and that. They have no idea what the operations were like because the people involved in those operations, have not been writing about it, okay? This is a dear man to me, Edu Boahen of Ghana. He's Professor Edu Boahen, history professor, who stood up to Jerry Rawlings and then ran against him the first time. And very courageously, Edu Boahen was able to, get up there during that military dictatorship. He's deceased, but, This is in Zambia. This is Chiluba, who became president and, of course, unfortunately went off the tracks as soon as he became president. But this was that period, leading up to it. This is my meeting with Walter Sisulu amazing family. I met many members of the Sisulu family during that period. And again, it was all part of these exploratory mission with South Africa. This is in Ghana, one of our great successes. I mean, collectively, with the Electoral Commission, my meeting there, this is a member of the commission, I was the then in the middle, the then chairman of the commission. We don't have, Michael here, but he hasn't seen any of the photographs. He's seen the documents. Riek Machar of South Sudan, unfortunately, as you know, became the vice president. The problems, this was just one of many missions there to try and deal with that struggle there. This meeting with Bishop Tutu, this was a personal thing. In fact, Bishop Tutu was mocking me because I was begging him to come to Liberia. We weren't making any progress. This was his assistant here, and the assistant was saying, no, there's no way we can do it. And he just looked at me and said, and he started imitating me. And he basically said, yes, Richard, I will come. And he came to Liberia. We had an incredible meeting, had to meet with Charles Steele and so on. This is my meeting with John Garang in Nairobi during that period when there was a split between Garang and Riek Machar, and I was literally shuttling between Garang and Riek Machar. This is a meeting with Jerry Rawlings after it, and we're just coming out of a meeting where Rawlings was criticizing me while I stood in the back of the room, a kind of a James Comey kind of experience. As I'm trying to make my, but anyway, everybody was happy then. But I was front and center because President Carter couldn't be there for the elections, so I had to play that role, and which means I had to deal with Rawlings and others. This is a meeting just in June at the Ibadan School of Government and Public Policy. There are many of I have my former students, colleagues, and so on involved here. They're really doing great work. This is Ghana in June of 2009 with Obama. An incredible scene. I have lots of photographs, but I just saw this one. This is nice. This is another recent meeting here in Kano, Mambaya House, associated with the University of Kano. And I made them a promise, and I'm looking at that, I remember my promise. They took me through their library, and I saw Aminu Kano. He was a political leader there, and in fact, he's buried there on their ground. And then I told them, I have these speaking notes from Aminu Kano when he was running for president in 1979, and they were looking at me very astonished. And then I explained to them what happened. I said there was this rally, and after the rally, I noticed, Aminu Kano had left and all his people had left, and I realized there were these papers sitting on his podium. I went up there, and it was actual notes that he had sent up. So for safekeeping, so I promised them I will get them the notes. But anyway, I have photographs here from family because it goes back further, but I'll just run through them. One reason I guess I'm looking at this is I'm just dealing with the immigrant experience. This is my maternal grandmother. Came to the U.S. After World War I, had to return. Her husband died in the New York subway incident with promising, and this is my mother after World War II, leaving. I'm the little guy over on the right? And if anybody wonders, was Richard living in a villa in Port of Spain as growing up? No, Richard was living in public housing, wore alpargatas on my shoes, yeah, but I was well looked after. And this was my aunt who looked after us. I put my grandfather up there because I have lots of pictures of him in these Edwardian suits. And people say, so he was an executive in the oil industry? No, he wasn't. Elementary school education. He was a skilled worker, but he just gave you a sense. My father, and this is our departure for the U.S. I was in Ibadan at a restaurant sitting down. I had this gentleman walk over to me and just said to me, you're Dr. Richard Joseph, aren't you? I said, yes. I was a student of yours at Ibadan. He went on to serve in the Nigerian legislature, and he's now in business. Now, this woman here, Abiola, her father was elected president of Nigeria in 1993. He was then arrested, detained, died, and so on. I have a very simple solution for Nigeria, and that is to make Hafsat Abiola president by acclamation on the grounds that her father was elected president, did not fulfill his mandate. She's in the state government. She's an amazing woman, all right? Muslim woman, you know, Yoruba, I mean, and just incredible. So anyway, that's Hafsat. Okay, so next steps, I mentioned the lecture I'll be giving, all right, on December 4th. The books, because the work that we're doing is where we're going from book, you know, to digital, back to book. Because now people have been asking me over and over, when are you going to write another book on Nigeria? Well, the point is, yes, now I can write another book on Nigeria as a result of this work we're doing. Islands of Integrity, I'm discussing with colleagues here at Northwestern and elsewhere about it. Arch Library, of course, the digital learning, and this governance and development network. Okay, thank you all. It went on too long, but thank you. If anybody have any, you know, questions or anything? Is anybody? Esmeralda? Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious, how many students did you have working on the project?
This summer,
Yes.
we had 6. We had 4 that were supported, you know, by Weinberg, and then I had 1, Allison. We had a MacArthur grant. I was able to use some of that. And then we had a Farrell fellowship from the political science, Alex Smith. So this summer we had 6. But, you know, and the reason why I had that conversation with Mary Finn was I sent her a message. I said, Mary, you know, I am working with, you know, I have students in my class and I'm having them as research assistants. I'm getting, you know, funding from wherever I could find it, right? And I said, I realized that, you know, the time has come to try and create something, you know, that has some coherence. And that is where we came together and they told me about this opportunity and it really worked, you know, marvelously. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. All right. One more here. Oh, we have 2 more. Go ahead and then take you and then we'll conclude. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really wonderful. I had a question about the steps you took. I think a lot of people talk about open access. They talk about just sending stuff out there really quickly. But it sounds like this process was very slow and methodical.
Extreme.
Ethical issues with what to include in the archive and whatnot.
Ex-
I was curious about what kind of ethical issues you confronted going through the archive and
Sorry about it. Well, I don't know of any ethical issues as such. Some of the documents, especially from my Carter Center period, is where, you know, there were internal documents. So there are documents of communication with President Carter. There were communications with President Carter with some of our political leaders. And, you know, so there are documents that are a little more sensitive. There's nothing that is confidential, you know, because when we met with President Carter, I mean, I was amazed at how candid he was about some of the things, right? So, so I don't ethical. We had one case of, you know, we had to get copyright permission, and there was one publisher that we really had to, you know, do so. The work was, and let me just talk about one part of it, the Nigerian Crucible. I mean, where that started off was that my wife Jennifer, you know, who decided that, all right, she's going to help me with my papers, right? And so, you know, at the, you know, in Chambers, I have my office, but I also have another office because I have so many files and so many books. And she came in and started working on it. And then I have had, in 2015 and in 2016, research students working with me, and I said, listen, there is this thing I really wanted to do in my papers, and they're the ones who really got to work. They got really excited about it. They started pulling this down, putting it together, and then when I looked at it, I thought, oh my goodness, these guys are coming up with something, and then we just went to work with that. But I can't think of any kind of ethical issues. I mean, I go over everything, you know, very thoroughly, and I mean, they meet the standard that I set for myself in terms of anything I want to put out there. So, you know, people could be able to go right in there and use them, you know, reference them as they would, you know, any of my published material. I mean, they are of that standard for me personally. Yeah. And one more, yes.
Thank you so much. I've been following you since before I got to this school, and
You've been following what, sorry?
your work
Yeah.
before I got to this school,
And you still came.
Yeah, right. You were the first point of contact before I got here,
Okay.
and you've done a tremendous amount of work in Nigeria and Cameroon.
Right.
But since then, a lot have changed, especially in Cameroon,
Right.
in terms of succession between the Anglophone and the Francophone.
Right.
So, departing from Cameroon, you come to Togo, where recently there is a little bit, skirmish between the oppositions and the ruling party.
Okay.
So, what did you think is the way forward in those parts of African continent?
All right. So I'll
In
be.
terms of governance and democratization.
Okay, all right. So very quickly, there is a difference between the former French and the English-speaking countries, all right? And I could function in the former French countries because fluently in French. I tend not to speak French now. I do if I have to, because it's so much associated for me with, a different France than the France that many of you are aware of. Okay. In terms of both countries, and in fact, in the case of Cameroon, and Esmeralda Kali could tell you, here talking about open access and media, and you saw what I put up there with one of the quotes of saying of how the digitization and internet, information technologies are now being used to counter the processes. We assume that there's going to be this opening, more information. Now it's more and more the case. So in the case of Cameroon, where we've had continual phases of repression, is where they've shut down the social media, just shut it down. And Esmeralda Kali happened to be there, right, when they had that experience. In the case of Togo, and just a quick word because, I have my personal experience in Togo. One of my dearest friends was a Togolese, way back, Edgar Dalmeda was his name. And so during the period in which you had during the late 80s, 1990s, what's going on in Ghana, you now had these uprisings in Togo. And I traveled to Togo. And in fact, I did meet I remember one time I arrived at a meeting and along with the U.S. ambassador. And we walked into this room to go and have a meeting with Eyadema, and that is when they were trying to move him aside. This is a general who was there for many years. Anyway, as we walked through, the ambassador just sort of whispered to me, I think we stumbled onto this, this scene. But I want to say something just very quickly about the Togo experience, because we had a student looking at it here. When Togo was having that first set of elections, and in many cases, President Carter would ask me, what did I think about the prospects? Because did we think so? Because it was, we're not going to, I'm talking about we as the Carter Center, would not get involved if it didn't feel you could really make a difference, have an impact. In the case of Togo, I didn't feel so, because Eyadema was coming back to power and in charge of everything. But President Carter decided he was going to go because of his church things on. There was a missionary who was urging him to go. So he decided he was going to go. But Togo was the only case, as far as I know, that the Carter Center and its affiliates, in this case the National Democratic Institute, did not stay in the country. They ordered everybody to leave the country on election day because they didn't even want to be present in Togo, when the elections took place. So right up to, they kept doing everything, and when they realized the fraud that was going on. So I'm sorry. So what you're experiencing today, Eyadema Jr. is there, just like Bongo Jr. is there. I mean, in Gabon. All right. I tell you what. Could we? I think we'd call and anybody. All right. Go quickly.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Mbulo, anthropology PhD student.
Okay.
My interest is in East Africa,
Yeah.
Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, where we see the return of autocracy and the kind of dictatorship that is happening. What would be your kind of advice towards democracy and open access? And then
For where? For which country?
Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And then my last question is that do you think open access would overcome the the barriers of knowledge production and access to knowledge in African countries, because we know that knowledge production has been a great problem for even the scholars in those particular countries.
Okay, so let me just say, first, I can't answer all of that fully, but I do say that you've given me a very good introduction for some of the events we're going to be doing with Freedom Gates, right? But I just want to say two things specifically. Kenya now is very much in focus because what happened, with the elections, you'll be very much, aware of that and going forward. And I think that I just attended a conference on constitutionalism at the Chicago Law School, and we had Professor Gathi, who's here at the Loyola Law School, made a presentation right about it. And so I think Kenya is, despite the difficulties, and hopefully they'll be able to just avoid extreme levels of violence. But I think Kenya is still a very important prospect for having a transition, because so many changes have been put in place. All right. In terms of Uganda, it's a much more difficult situation because of how Museveni has really manipulated the situation so much, and how much he's been able to tie into a lot of the security influence. But I'll say one last thing about Museveni. Museveni, because as you all can see from some of the things I put up there, I did a lot of traveling around the continent during that period, and usually working with our local embassies. I mean, the Carter Center was independent, but we would have the attention. Well, when I went to Kampala during that period, and our ambassador tried to set up a meeting with Museveni, and Museveni would not see me, and none of his senior people would not see me. They wouldn't even talk about, because they had in mind, what these people are talking about. Okay? All right, thank you.